Have you ever been warned about something? Something that felt so out of place, so unsettling, that even the mere mention of it made you shiver? Imagine hearing a story so chilling that it made you doubt your own senses. A tale so strange that it haunted you, even after you dismissed it as just a warning. A place you were told never to go, but that you couldn't stop thinking about once you heard about it. Something so mysterious that the warnings weren't just advice, but an unspoken rule, an invisible barrier, a dark cloud that hung heavy in the air. Now, imagine that place is in a quiet town, nestled at the edge of a vast, untamed wilderness. A town where life moves at a slow pace, the kind of place that feels like it belongs to a different time. There's an unsettling quiet about it, as if the trees, the houses, and even the people are somehow all holding their breath. And beyond that town, stretching for miles, lies an ancient forest, a place so dense and so wild that it doesn't even appear on any map. It's not that the forest is a secret, everyone knows it's there. But the very fact that it doesn't show up on any map, that it's not marked by any roads, trails, or landmarks, is enough to make people feel like they shouldn't ask questions. It might as well be a hidden place, something so forgotten that no one dares to speak its name aloud. And the few who do, they don't speak of it with curiosity. They speak in hushed tones, voices trembling with a fear that can't be explained. For generations, the townspeople have passed down one rule, one simple, unwavering piece of advice: stay away. And for the most part, people do. They don't question it. They don't ask why. They just know better than to ignore it. There's no detailed warning, no grand tale of horror to make you shiver, no graphic description of what happens to those who disobey. It's not a story meant to frighten children. It's not a tale with monsters or ghosts lurking behind every tree. It's something darker, something that hangs over the town like a shadow, something that everyone instinctively knows to avoid. And yet, that's all the warning there is: stay away. It's enough to make anyone pause, even the most skeptical of people. You might laugh it off at first. It seems so simple, so harmless. After all, people have been venturing into the woods for years. Sure, some may have gotten lost, but that happens in any forest, right? Others have gotten hurt, but that's just the risks of nature. And besides, you tell yourself, it's just an old superstition passed down to keep people from wandering too far. But then, the whispers begin. The stories that start innocently enough. A hiker lost for days, a group of campers whose tents were found untouched, abandoned in the middle of the forest. No sign of them, no trace of their journey. And when people start to talk about it, they talk quietly, eyes darting to the shadows. I heard the old man in the diner used to go out there every year, long before you were born. But he never spoke of it after. Not a word. Just went up there to check on something. He doesn't go anymore. Some folks around here are real quiet about it, you know. They know better than to say anything. I heard the forest changes you, makes you forget, makes you not even care about what happens to those who walk in. As unsettling as the stories are, no one really thinks they're true. For a long time, these strange tales are nothing more than local gossip. Over the years, they become nothing more than the usual kind of folklore passed down through generations. Nothing to worry about, nothing to take seriously. It's just the kind of thing to tell children to scare them away from wandering too far. But there are always those who believe they know better. But even they couldn't escape the truth when it finally came to light. People began to disappear, one by one at first. A hiker, a man out for a leisurely walk through the woods, gone without a trace. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, no trail left behind. At first, No one thought much of it. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he wandered too far. People got lost in the woods all the time. It wasn't uncommon. But then another group of campers went missing. This time, their tents were found, but there was nothing inside. No belongings, no signs of a struggle, not even any footprints leading away from the site. The campsite was untouched, as if they had vanished into thin air. Search parties were sent out, but they returned with the same response each time. There's nothing there. As the disappearances continued, so did the whispers. The stories no longer seemed like harmless local tales. They were becoming real. The woods were not just a place to avoid. They were dangerous, but there was still no explanation. No one had found a body. No one had found evidence of anything other than an eerie stillness that had crept into the forest over the years. The people who disappeared, they were never found. But those who returned were never the same. They came back with empty eyes, their faces drawn, their voices distant. Some of them even moved away, abandoning their homes, never speaking again about what had happened to them in the woods. The thing that made it most unsettling was that no one ever found any physical evidence. There were no signs of a struggle, no bloodshed, no wreckage, just nothing. And so, the warnings persisted. The town remained quiet about the forest, but everyone who lived there knew the rule: stay away. The warnings were passed down. They became not just advice, but a fact of life. Stay away. Parents told their children, neighbors warned newcomers, and for years, everyone who lived there simply followed the rule. Until one day, the peace of the town was shattered. 5 friends, Emma, Mark, Rachel, Tyler, and Jay, decided to challenge the rule. They had grown up hearing the same stories, hearing the same warnings, just like everyone else. They had repeated the warnings themselves, making jokes about it, mocking the older folks. But in the back of their minds, they knew. They had heard the stories. They had heard the warnings, but none of it ever seemed real to them. Mark was the first to suggest it. A camping trip. One night, out in the woods. Nothing serious, just enough to prove the warnings were nonsense. "Let's go," he said. "It'll be a laugh. Just a couple of hours in the forest, and we'll come back and tell everyone how silly it all was." Rachel was the first to agree. She had always dismissed the warnings as ridiculous. Emma hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. "It's just another hike," she told herself. "We'll prove it's nothing." Tyler loved the idea. He always enjoyed a good adventure. And Jay never argued. He just nodded, grabbed his backpack, and followed. They didn't tell anyone where they were going. Why would they? There was no danger. It was just a forest, just a couple of hours in the woods. They set off as the sun began to sink below the horizon. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. Just another hike. The forest smelled of damp earth, and the soft rustling of the leaves filled the air. The trail was narrow but clear. The sun was low, casting long shadows as they walked. But as they ventured deeper, the woods began to change. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches intertwining above their heads like skeletal fingers. The path became harder to follow, the trees growing closer together, their branches weaving a dense canopy that blocked out the light. It felt wrong. At first, people thought it was just a story, a tall tale to keep children close to home, to scare off the curious wanderers and the adventurous souls. A harmless legend passed down from one generation to the next, with each telling growing more elaborate over time. Maybe the stories were exaggerated. Maybe they were just cautionary tales, woven into the fabric of the town's culture. After all, What harm could a story do? The warnings were nothing more than that. Words meant to discourage the reckless, to protect those too eager to tread into the unknown. And for years, that's all it was. Folklore. Just another tradition meant to keep people from wandering into unexplored terrain. The adults, the ones who had grown up hearing the same stories, shared the warnings with a smile and a shake of their heads, as if it were all a joke. They would say it in a playful tone. Stay away from the forest, or the woods will keep you. And the children, wide-eyed and trembling, would listen. Some out of fear, some out of respect, and some just because they were told to. But once the sun set and the day grew older, the warnings seemed to lose their power. People would laugh, shrug, and continue with their lives, dismissing the warnings as nothing more than nonsense. But then, something began to change. Something that made those who had long ago dismissed the warnings stop in their tracks and think twice. Something happened. It started slowly, like a whisper on the wind, barely noticeable at first, but growing louder with each passing week. The first incident wasn't enough to make anyone panic. It was just a blip on the radar. A hiker, someone from out of town, had gone missing. They were experienced, or so they thought, and they'd ventured into the forest alone. No one thought much of it. After all, people got lost all the time in forests. It was a dangerous place to be, sure, but people had been going into those woods for years. The police chalked it up to poor judgment. Maybe the hiker took a wrong turn. Maybe they slipped and fell down a ravine. They searched for a few days, but they never found anything. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood, no broken branches, no footprints leading in or out. Just a man gone, like he never existed, as if he had simply stepped into the forest and vanished. People brushed it off. They made excuses, pointing fingers at the man's poor judgment or his lack of experience. After all, there were plenty of places in the woods where a person could get lost, and plenty of animals that could do damage, leaving no trace behind. That was the logical explanation, wasn't it? But the doubts began to creep in, uninvited, like shadows at dusk. But then it happened again. Another group of campers, 4 this time, decided to spend the night in the woods. They were all seasoned outdoors enthusiasts, well prepared for what they thought would be an ordinary camping trip. They told their families they'd be back by morning. They set up camp in the heart of the forest, pitching their tents near a stream where the water was fresh and clear. Everything seemed fine at first. The crackling sound of the campfire, the laughter echoing through the trees, the light of the flames dancing on their faces. But the next morning, when the sun rose, the campsite was empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of anything really. Their tents were undisturbed. The fire was out, but there were no footprints leading away from the site, no signs that they had packed up and left. The backpacks, the sleeping bags, and the food remained where it had all been the night before. It was as though the group had simply vanished into thin air. No trace, no note, just nothing. The search parties were sent out immediately. It was the usual procedure: search teams, local volunteers, and some trained trackers. They combed through the area, starting with the stream and the clearing where the tents had been. But after hours of searching, the result was always the same. Nothing. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, no signs of life, not even the faintest trace of the campers having been there. It was as though the forest had swallowed them whole, leaving nothing behind. The police were baffled. How could a group of 4 people simply vanish? Where had they gone? Why was there no sign of a struggle, no clue as to where they could have gone? And here's where things got truly strange. Some of the searchers, people who had lived in the area for years, started acting odd. They wouldn't talk about the search. They wouldn't even make eye contact. When asked what they thought happened, they would look away and change the subject. If pressed further, they'd say, "There's nothing out there, nothing to find." One of the volunteers, an older man who had been living in the area for decades, returned from the search with a faraway look in his eyes. He wouldn't say anything for days. When someone finally asked him what had happened, he just shook his head and muttered under his breath, "Some places aren't meant to be searched." At this point, the town began to feel it. A quiet tension, a ripple in the air. Something wasn't right, and the warnings, the old warnings, started to feel more and more real. But still, people tried to brush it off. They tried to explain it. Maybe the group had gotten lost and wandered too far. Maybe they had found some way to escape the woods on their own. Maybe the police had missed something. But the forest wasn't done yet. Another week passed, and there were more whispers in town, more strange stories. There were reports of people walking near the woods, people who had lived there their whole lives, who suddenly couldn't remember the paths they were walking on. Some of them had even wandered deep into the trees, only to find themselves lost, disoriented, unable to remember how they'd gotten there. One of the local farmers, a man named Hank, had spent his life living near the forest. He'd never been afraid of it, never thought much of the old stories. He'd been cutting wood near the edge of the trees one afternoon when he claimed he heard something strange, a whisper, almost like a voice calling to him. But when he looked around, there was no one there. The voice was gone, but the woods had shifted. Hank couldn't explain it. He couldn't explain why. When he turned around, the trees seemed to be in a different position, or why the shadows seemed longer than they should be. He shook it off, but he knew something had changed. The woods weren't like they used to be. And then, just days later, he disappeared. Once again, there was no sign of struggle, no footprints, no tracks, no blood. He had simply vanished, as though he had stepped off the face of the earth. The town was gripped with fear now. People started leaving. Families packed up and moved, some going to other parts of the state, others just vanishing. The local diner closed, its owner disappearing without a trace. The town felt abandoned, as if something invisible had swept through and taken everything with it. The stories were no longer just folklore. The woods were no longer a place of mystery. They were a place of danger. The warnings were no longer passed off as tales to scare children. They were a matter of life and death. People realized too late that the forest wasn't something to mock. It wasn't just a place to explore. It was something else. And now the forest had chosen. The whispers started again, creeping through the streets, slipping under doors and into ears. Stories of those who came back from the forest, but didn't really return. They were there, but they were no longer themselves. People who had gone into the woods had ventured too far and had seen something they could never speak of. Something so unsettling that it erased parts of their soul, leaving them hollow. Their faces were pale, so pale it was as if they had not seen the sun in years. Their eyes were empty, hollow, like two dark wells with no bottom, and their voices, soft, as though they were whispering to themselves, unable or unwilling to speak the truth of what they'd experienced. Sometimes they could manage a few words, but it was as if they had forgotten how to speak, how to be. Some of them had been gone for days, some for weeks. When they returned, no one could recognize them. They looked like the people they once were, but it was clear something had changed, something that couldn't be undone. What did they see? Some of them would try to speak. They would recount their time in the forest, but their stories made no sense. They described twisted shapes, shifting shadows, and voices that whispered their names in the dark. Others refused to speak at all, their eyes darting nervously, their bodies trembling at the mere mention of the place. They would often wake in the middle of the night, screaming, and when asked about it, they could never say exactly why. And then there were those who tried to explain it away. They called it shock, or post-traumatic stress, or simple confusion. But deep down, everyone knew it was more than that. Something darker lingered in the woods, something that took pieces of the people who went in and never returned. And as the stories continued to pile up, the whispers began to change. With each disappearance, the warnings became harder to ignore. They weren't just tales anymore. They weren't just stories passed around in hushed tones to frighten children. The woods weren't some mysterious part of the land that people just didn't understand. No, the truth was far worse than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just fear anymore. It wasn't just, maybe they got lost. It was certainty. The woods chose who would be taken. People were no longer wandering in the woods and disappearing randomly. The forest wasn't indifferent. No, it was a place with a mind of its own. A place that decided who was worthy of being taken. And once you crossed into that dark, overgrown land, you didn't get to leave unscathed. There was always a price to pay. You could feel it in the air. The forest didn't care if you believed in it. It didn't care if you were skeptical or if you mocked the stories. It didn't care if you thought it was all just an old superstition. The woods weren't there to cater to your beliefs. They didn't need your permission to take what it wanted. It had always been this way. And still, people didn't listen. It wasn't just that they didn't believe. The warnings didn't faze them anymore. For every story of someone who had returned wrong, there was always someone ready to dismiss it. There's nothing to fear, they'd say. Just old stories to scare kids. It's just a superstition. There were always people who thought they knew better, who didn't believe in ghosts, in cursed places. They thought it was just fear-mongering, stories crafted by generations of people who didn't understand the world. They were the kind of people who scoffed at the mention of the forest, rolled their eyes and laughed when someone warned them. That's just an old wives' tale meant to keep people inside. They would mock the warnings, scoff at the idea of a cursed place, and then laugh about it, as though it were nothing more than a joke. They wouldn't be the ones to fall prey to such superstitions. But as the disappearances mounted and the stories began to take on a darker tone, even the most skeptical couldn't ignore the truth. The warnings were no longer a joke. Something was out there, and it wasn't just a harmless forest. That's when 5 friends decided to take matters into their own hands. They had heard the warnings just like everyone else. They had laughed about them, dismissed them as silly, and maybe, just maybe, they felt a little braver than the others. They had grown tired of hearing the same old stories, tired of seeing the fear in the eyes of the older generations. The stories didn't make sense. It was just a forest, nothing more. Mark was the first to suggest it. Let's go into the woods, a camping trip, just one night. Nothing serious, nothing to worry about, just enough to prove that the stories were nonsense. Come on, he said. It's just a forest. What's the worst that can happen? Rachel was the first to agree. She had always been the skeptic, always the one to question everything. She didn't believe in superstitions, and she wasn't going to start now. She'd heard the stories, of course. She'd heard about the disappearances, but those were just people who got lost. Maybe they wandered off the path. Maybe they were just afraid of something they couldn't explain. Emma hesitated, her mind spinning with the warnings she had heard growing up. but she didn't want to be the one to hold them back. It was just a hike, right? Tyler, ever the storyteller, loved the idea. The perfect material for a new adventure, something to spin into a great tale to tell around the campfire. He wasn't one to shy away from the unknown. After all, that's where the best stories came from. And Jay had never been one to speak up. He just nodded, packed his gear, and followed. It was always the same with him. Never one to argue, never one to question. He just went along. They made their plans. One night in the forest, a few tents, some flashlights, some food, and water. That's all they needed. They didn't tell anyone where they were going. After all, they weren't doing anything dangerous. Just a couple of friends spending the night in the woods. What could go wrong? They left just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. At first, it was just like any other hike. The trees weren't menacing. The air wasn't thick with danger. Everything was calm, peaceful even. The sun set slowly, casting long shadows across the path. The light played off the leaves and branches, creating a serene atmosphere. But as they ventured deeper into the forest, something began to shift. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around them. The path they had been following became less distinct, the shadows growing darker and longer. The once peaceful sounds of the forest, birds, the rustle of small creatures, began to fade into silence. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Something wasn't right. They didn't say it aloud, but they all felt it. Every step seemed heavier than the last. Every whisper of the wind felt wrong. They pressed on anyway. After all, what could it hurt? But they had no idea just how wrong it was going to get. Emma, the rational one of the group, had grown tired of hearing the warnings about the forest. For years she'd heard them, whispers from the older townsfolk, cautionary tales about the untamed wilderness just beyond their small town. But to Emma, the warnings didn't make sense. They were born from superstition, old fears that had no place in the world she knew. In her mind, the forest was just a patch of trees, a stretch of land, and the stories surrounding it were nothing more than a way to keep people from straying too far. But the truth, deep down, was something she couldn't shake. The idea of the forest always nagged at her. It was an unknown, and the unknown always stirred something inside her. Mark, on the other hand, was the thrill seeker, always chasing excitement, always wanting something new, something daring. He was the kind of person who found comfort in the unfamiliar, and the more people told him not to do something, the more he was drawn to it. A sense of rebellion coursed through him, always testing boundaries and pushing limits. The forest, it was just another challenge waiting to be conquered. Rachel, the skeptic, couldn't stand the idea of people being so afraid of something so ordinary. She couldn't understand why the town continued to live in fear. Sure, the forest was big and dark, but so were a lot of places. There was nothing special about it. No reason it should be feared. She rolled her eyes whenever someone mentioned it. After all, what was fear without proof? The stories were just that, stories. Tyler, the storyteller, loved a good adventure. But it wasn't just about the thrill for him. For Tyler, every adventure was an opportunity to find new material for his stories. He dreamed of telling tales that would leave his audience on the edge of their seats, breathless and hanging on every word. The forest, with all its mystery, seemed like the perfect place to discover something that would make for a legendary story. And Jay was the quiet one. He never said much, never raised his voice, always content to go along with whatever the group decided. He was the kind of person who went along with the flow, never questioning, never challenging. When his friends made a decision, he followed without hesitation. For years, they'd heard the same stories everyone else did. They'd repeated the warnings themselves, laughing at how silly they sounded. But then one weekend, Mark suggested something. "Let's prove it once and for all," Mark said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Let's go in and see for ourselves. It'll be fun. We'll laugh about it later." Rachel was the first to agree. "I've heard these stories for learn that would change everything." Rachel was the first to agree. "I've heard these stories for years. I'm sick of them. Let's just go in and show everyone how ridiculous it is." Emma hesitated, as she always did. The warnings had always weighed on her. But her curiosity and a desire to prove she wasn't afraid of nothing won out. "It's just a hike," she said. "Nothing dangerous." She tried to convince herself. How bad could it be? Tyler was already packing his gear, excited about the story he would tell. "It's perfect," he said. "Great material for a new story. We'll come back with a tale that'll make the others think twice." And Jay? Jay just nodded, grabbed his backpack, and silently followed. They packed light, just a tent, a few flashlights, food, and water. Nothing extravagant, no real planning, no preparation. To them, this was just another hike, a way to prove the forest wasn't as terrifying as people made it out to be. After all, how could it be? They didn't tell anyone where they were going. Why would they? They weren't doing anything dangerous. They weren't kids anymore. It was just a forest, and they were adults. The woods were nothing more than trees and dirt. It wasn't real. But the forest had been waiting for them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they set off into the woods. At first, everything seemed normal. The air was crisp and fresh. The sound of leaves crunching beneath their boots was a familiar and comforting sound. The tall trees, stretching upward toward the sky, seemed to offer an embrace as they passed by. The scent of damp earth filled the air, natural, untouched. Nothing was out of place. But as they ventured deeper, something began to shift. The trees began to close in around them, their branches twisting together like arms reaching out to trap them. The sunlight, which had once bathed the trail, was now barely making it through the thick canopy above. The forest seemed to grow darker, quicker than they had expected. The silence, that was the first thing that struck them. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. The usual sounds of the wild, the chirping birds, the rustling of small creatures, had all vanished. There was nothing. No wind, no insects, no rustling leaves. The stillness was suffocating, unnatural. Rachel, ever the skeptic, tried to lighten the mood. "It's just the forest at night, guys. Nothing unusual. It's probably just the time of day," she joked, though even her voice trembled slightly. But no one laughed. The others felt it too. The weight of the silence, the way it pressed down on their shoulders, almost like the forest itself was holding its breath, watching. It wasn't the animals. It wasn't the trees. It was something else, something waiting. Then they came upon the first mark, a symbol carved deeply into the bark of a tree. It wasn't a random scratch. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect from an animal or even another camper. No, this was different. The lines were sharp, deliberate, and the design was strangely complex. Emma's fingers hovered over the symbol. Something about it made her skin crawl. She felt a sudden unease, a chill crawling up her spine, but she reached out anyway. Her breath caught in her throat before she could touch it. There was something wrong about it. They kept walking, but the unease didn't leave them. The further they went, the more they saw. Symbols, markings carved into trees every few yards. Different shapes, different patterns, but always the same sharp, meticulous etchings. It felt deliberate. It felt like someone or something was leading them. They tried to laugh it off. "Probably just some kids messing around," Tyler said. But there was no conviction in his voice. Then came the first whisper, a voice, soft, faint, barely audible, yet so clear that it made Jason, the most skeptical of the group, pause. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. No one else had heard it, but Jason swore it had spoken his name. "It said my name," he insisted. He tried to dismiss it as the wind, but deep down something inside him told him that wasn't it. It wasn't the wind. The whispers grew more frequent. They came from the shadows, from places where they couldn't see, growing louder, more distinct. It was as if the forest itself was alive, listening, waiting for them to make a mistake. Then they found the clearing. At the center, resting alone and forgotten, was a doll. Its face was pale, cracked and worn, its clothes tattered and torn, its eyes gone. The sight of it made their stomachs turn. This wasn't just a forgotten trinket, lost and left behind. This was a message. The whispers returned. This time, they were louder, closer. They weren't alone. The night dragged on, and the tension only grew. They set up camp quickly, but no one spoke much. The silence was too oppressive. Even the fire, once a source of warmth, now felt like an anchor, keeping them tethered in a place they didn't understand. They gathered firewood, their hands shaking as they went about their task, trying to push aside the nagging feeling that something was wrong. That's when they found it, another doll, lying just off the trail. At first, they thought it was some other camper's forgotten toy, but this one was different. It wasn't theirs. It hadn't been there when they arrived. It had simply appeared, sitting there waiting for them. None of them said a word, but all of them felt it. The fear creeping up from their stomachs, settling into their chests. Something had changed. The woods were no longer just trees. They weren't just a place of nature. No, the woods had become something else. And then, just as they were beginning to gather themselves, it came. The scream. A sound so primal, so raw, that it seemed to echo through the very air around them. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was a scream of pure terror. The kind of scream that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. And then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The silence returned, but it was different. It was heavier. It was thicker. They weren't alone. What would you do if you were told never to go into the woods? Would you listen? Or would you ignore the warnings driven by curiosity and venture into the unknown? These 5 friends thought they were different. They thought they were invincible, but the woods had claimed them. And no matter how much they tried to convince themselves otherwise, there would be no escaping the price they would pay for ignoring the warnings.